Our next speaker is also very well known, and recently he had a flight with one of Leo Peake's free flights up the coast. And of course, being a gentleman, he was the last in, which meant he found himself sitting in the right-hand front seat with a wheel in front of him. So Leo let him fly, and when they went as far as they were going to go inland and they had to come back over the sea, he told him to do a left-hand turn. And he said what was noticeable was that the BSI didn't fluctuate 1 centimetre. And he said, how long is it since you've flown? And he said, 47 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce to you Chip Harvey for a talk about Spitfires.
I'd lost my sight. The only thing about it was that I found the other day that I had a certificate for blind flying. I won't bore you with an awful lot. Some of you may remember a couple of years ago I was talking about my training, so I'll gloss over that. But what I do remember was that the day that war broke out, I listened to Neville Chamberlain telling us that we were at war. That was on the Sunday. On the Monday I went down to volunteer for aircrew. And the flight sergeant said, yes, well, how old are you? I'm 18. He said, well, tell me, when you learn to shave and you reach 17 and a half, please come back. The best thing you can do is to join the LDV, the Local Defence Volunteers, which later became the Home Guard. That I did, and that's another story. When eventually I did get down, because I kept pestering this fella, and eventually he said, look, go off down to Watchbridge and take the entrance exam. They took it, and surprisingly enough, they were obviously terribly short of pilots, so I was enlisted as a pilot. When I did my initial training, we did it down in the south coast of England, and having passed that, one of the two things that I remember fairly clearly, one was the headlines in the local rag, plus all the other papers, was that Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, had flown a Messerschmitt 110 from Denmark across to Scotland and had bailed out on the west coast, some 20 miles south of the Duke of Hamilton's estate. And when he was captured by two of the local Home Guard, he demanded to be taken to the Duke of Hamilton, who he had met in Germany in 1934. Duke of Hamilton was flying with the RAF in 1933 and was one of the first flights to fly over Everest. He was in Germany on a goodwill mission, and so Hess was using this. Now, rumour had it, of course, and the various papers blew it up out of all proportion, that he'd flown over with a peace proposition, and of course, as we know now, Churchill had nothing whatever to do with him. He spent time in prison, and later, after the Nuremberg trial, was sent to the Spandau prison, where he died on, again, very obscure circumstances. The second thing was that we were to be posted overseas for our training, and our training was to be under the Arnold scheme. Now, those of you who don't know what the Arnold scheme was, it was instigated by General Arnold. He flew for the first time in 1907, if I remember rightly, in one of the Wright's aircraft. He subsequently flew in France and during the war, and by the time I'm talking about, had become the aviation advisor to President Roosevelt. He knew very well that Churchill was constantly getting on to Roosevelt and saying, come on, help us, join the war, do anything you can. And he came up with the idea, he said, look, send us the potential air crew and we'll put them into the Air Corps and train them and send them back. Now, it turned out that I was one of the 300 that had been taken to go on the third course. And we went up to Scotland, went onto the Stratheden liner, a PO ship of some 26,000 tonne, got down the Clyde, out into the Irish Sea, and up into the Atlantic. Now this, this was right at the time that later was called the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans' U-boats claimed between May and November 1941 that they sank 2.5 million tonnes of Allied shipping. Later, the Admiralty confirmed that they actually sunk 1,756,000. But nevertheless, a hell of a carnage and a horrible time to be doing it. We had 2 destroyers that went round us like a working sheepdog, and we got through to Halifax Harbour in 5 days, unscathed. We went from there by train to Toronto, and having a week in Toronto, which of course I could take a half an hour to tell you about Florence and my trip down to Niagara Falls, but that's another story. And we changed into our grey flannel suits, applied for visas to go into the States, and went by night across to Detroit, and there joined the Louisville Railroad Company train down to the southern states. We arrived in Georgia, Alabama, and what a shock. Got onto the bus to take us to Dar Aerotrek, the training station, and there was in big notices, because segregation was rigidly enforced, big notice, whites only. And we saw that, of course, in hotels, cinemas, drugstores, and everything else. We were escorted by cops on Harley Davidson carrying sidearms, something which we hadn't seen before. Let's talk about flying. We got out to Dar Aerotrek. This was the station for primary training. We were issued with US Army Air Corps uniforms, sent to the barber who took shears, and he would have won any competition at any show here. In a matter of 2 minutes we were denuded of all hair except for a quarter of an inch overall. People pay something like $20 or $30 to get that nowadays, but they did it very quickly then. We were introduced to the system of discipline in the Army Air Corps, and that was run on a class distinction system with demerit points given for misdemeanors. You were allowed a certain number of demerit points, and if you exceeded those, you marched for 1 hour in full kit at 120 paces a minute. Now that might not seem very much, but you get 2 or 3 hours when you've only got a few hours off at the weekend, and you've got to march, it cuts into your time quite a bit. And however, just as a sort, I remember one fiery Welshman who, when he was hazed, because they did quite a bit of hazing, you had to salute officers, and of course we were used to doing it this way, and they had to do it that way, and you got demerit points if you didn't. If you went on the parade ground, you got demerits. If you didn't salute the flag, you got demerits, and so it went on. And one Welshman who was told by one of the things, they said, now be an aeroplane this, and so he went and he said that he couldn't do that, and they said, why? He said, the aircraft's unserviceable. So he got 10 demerit points for insubordination. He promptly told the officer what to do with his demerit points, and a week later was on his way back to Canada. The story didn't really finish there, because they took him 3 weeks to get back. He got lost in New York, and he told them they was put on the wrong train. However, the training was terrific. We had civilian instructors both in the ground school, but get to the flight line, get to the stuff that you all come here to hear about. We were trained on the Boeing Stearman. Now, a lot of you here have most probably flown Stearman, and I think you'll agree with me that that's me taxiing out there, by the way. I think the thing about it was it's a docile aircraft, lovely to handle, a good thing to fly on it. The fact that it's got half as big again as a Tiger Moth really doesn't matter. And we had civilian instructors who were absolutely terrific. All they wanted to do was to fly and to teach people how to fly. And I honestly believe that the grounding that I got there stayed with me for the rest of my flying career, because the things that they taught us and the fact that we could fly aircraft that were so amenable stayed with me all the rest of my time, as I've just said. We had something like about 60 hours on them, and we graduated from there to go to basic training, which was up in Macon, Georgia, and there it was a different story. It was a real army camp. The West Point, the officers were all West Point graduates, and they were bastards. I don't want to mince my words, but they are. Discipline, for instance, was really stinking. Your beds had to be made with a 45-degree angle at the bottom. sheets were down by, turned down by 12 inches, not 11.5 or 12.5, 12 inches. They had to be tucked under so that when you threw a coin onto it, it rippled up there. If you didn't, you got the demerit points. And this went on, in fact, in the dining room. Actually, I think we should introduce this here. You sit on the first 6 inches of your chair, and if you touch the back of the chair, you get demerit points. We can charge you for it here. The other thing too was that it was enforced upon the flight line. When you went down to the flight line, at primary they were white. Here we had army officers, and they were again bad. They made it quite clear that they really hadn't got a lot of time for those liney people, and these were the aircraft that we flew, or tried to fly. It was at the Northrop basic training 13 and 13A. A low wing trainer, fixed undercarriage, full instrument panel and radio, but we had a lot of trouble with them because, how can I explain it? You flew one aircraft and you pulled it up and it stalled to the left. The next aircraft you pulled out and it stalled to the right, and the fact that you did a power stall didn't necessarily follow it was going to do exactly the same thing. In fact, you invariably finished up on your back. And I had an instructor, Lieutenant Hurley, is engraved on my heart, who smoked or chewed a cigar and called me a stupid son of a bitch and many other expletives that I have never heard before and have very seldom heard since. But however, we went. His trick was to say, well, we'll do a power stall, and halfway up, and just as before you didn't know which way it was going to flick, he'd turn off the fuel. And just to prove the point, when you're on your back, he'd take over the control, do a couple of barrel rolls, and say, we'll try again. After 10 hours of trying to do this, I had a check with the flight commander. Gave him a pretty reasonable flight, really, and he said, have you got any problems? And I said, yes, I don't believe that my instructor and I are particularly compatible. He didn't say very much, but the next day I received a new instructor who reminded me remarkably of Gary Grant, very laid back, and without any more ado, we went up and we were perfectly all right. He took me out to a small airfield, we did a couple of landings, he said, righto Harvey, take it away, do a couple more landings and pick me up here, and which I did. And he came back carrying a sack of pecan nuts that he'd been into the plantation next door, and we flew back to them. I paused for a moment to tell you that one of the things on the flight line was that if you did stupid things, like try to take off in course pitch, or downwind, or hit the petrol bowser, or anything like that, you got the wheel. Now the wheel was an aircraft wheel, and when threaded through the hub of this wheel was a large chain. And you were publicly humiliated and told, everybody was told about what stupid things you'd done, and you wore that wheel all the time except when you were flying, in bed, or at a meal. The reason I tell you that was because I went to solo after the next trip up with him, and he said, look, you've got no end of do on, get out there and do some aerobatics and really get to know the feel of the aircraft and build up your solo hours. So off I went, and the boys had told me that you don't have to listen to the tower all the time when you're up there, because if you turn it back to 550, you can listen to the local radio station. They play the Andrews Sisters singing I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, or Chattanooga Choo Choo. The Ink Spots were still singing, and Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller were belting it out. It was fantastic. So I got up there, and I rolled, and I stalled, and I looped, and I had a wonderful time. And suddenly realised that about the time I actually got back to the field, and so turned and flew north, I thought, well, I better go back down to the tower. And as the further north I flew, the tower got weaker and weaker, and it suddenly struck me that horrible feeling that you get when you reach for your wallet and you find it isn't there, and you realise that you're lost. Now, nowadays you can't get lost because you have satellite aids that tell you exactly where you are. But in the southern states, there's nothing very much except long fields, lots of swamps, and I had a very horrible feeling. Fortunately, in the distance I saw a railway line, and I knew that on the railway line the various sidings had the letters written all along the actual stations that they were. And so I climbed up to 3,000 feet, called the tower and said, look, I wasn't exactly sure where I was, and permission to fly under 500 feet just to check on the siding. The reason you do that is because if you flew under 500 feet without permission, you were back to Canada and off the course. They gave me permission. I went down, and engraved on my heart in great big letters was the name Milledgeville. Got out my maps, saw where I was, 65 miles northeast, where I thought I was south. Went back and told the tower where I was, and I was heading for home. They said, no, you won't. You'll climb to 5,000 feet, you'll turn on your landing lights, and you will circle Milledgeville, because in 10 minutes it'll be dark. Anybody who's flown in the tropics know how quickly it does get dark. I went up there with my landing lights, my instructor came back and we formatted back, and I landed perfectly safely. I don't know what anybody was worried about. The fact that there was an ambulance one side and a fire engine the other screaming up the runway beside me, they obviously were terribly twitchy. I wasn't. I was just thankful. But anyway, we went back, and my instructor said, flight commander will see you in the morning. The only consolation I took was that I'd got 20 minutes so night time that nobody on their course had got. The next day, it was announced, and I could see on guard the wheel, and to all and sundry they told me what a twit I'd been, but he said that in actual fact, you didn't lose your head, did the right things, and boy, you'll just get tender marrows. And I was very pleased about that, because Cadet Green, who had also got lost, had taken the unusual step of writing on a piece of paper saying, "Where am I?" and tossing it out of the window. how he was, I've never actually worked out what was going to happen after that. He actually trained on the local golf course and wrote off the aircraft in the bunker on the 7th fairway. He got the wheel, and 2 weeks later he also got back to Canada. The other thing that I remember about Cochrane Field in Macon was the fact that we were called up on parade on the 7th of December, and we heard Roosevelt tell us of the events that had happened at Pearl Harbor. And this was a tremendous shock to everybody, and I'm sure that some of the local inhabitants, even down in the deep south, were believing that tomorrow they were going to be bombed or something like that. But we proceeded to. The only other good thing about that came, it was getting a bit cooler, and from then on we were allowed to wear our AF uniforms when we left camp, went off camp on open post. And the open post, I might tell you, was something that was treasured, because let's face it, the southern girls were rolled up in their Cadillacs and Buicks, and let's face it, I'm very young lad, but I wasn't going to miss out on anything. And frankly, I didn't, but that's another story. From there, we went to our advanced training down in Alabama. And there, we went to the North American Harvey. And I'm sorry, I've lost my subject. Yeah, that's me in formation in a Harvard, and I think all of you who've flown a Harvard would agree that it's a terrific aircraft to fly and a terrific trainer. In fact, I was reading the other year now, come to think about it, when I could read, that they supplied something like 22 air forces with these trainers. The emphasis by now was not on ground school, and it certainly wasn't on giving demerits. They were interested, they knew we could fly, they were very interested in it, and we did a lot of formation flying. One of the things I remember, we were doing night formation flying, which to me seemed to be really stretching a bit much because you could only see the wingtip light and the exhaust manifolds. But from there we went off down to Florida, did some gunnery into the Gulf of Mexico, came back and graduated, and we graduated in true Hollywood style with marching girls, the band, the mayor, and all and sundry, with diplomas, etc., etc. And we got our American wings, honorary lieutenants in the US Army Air Corps, and as I mentioned earlier, a certificate for blind flying, which at the bottom said no peeking or something like that. We had 3 days leave in Miami, Georgia, which was absolutely fantastic. I could talk to you for half an hour on that, but I won't. You might find it far more interesting than this. One of the things that I do remember was that apart from the girls, there was a Pan American base down there that had the clippers on there. I went down to see that, and there was a float plane there that if you wanted, you could hire for $8 an hour, which would sound fantastic because I couldn't afford that, certainly not on Air Force pay. The weekend down there was quite fantastic, and I frankly don't remember very much about the 3-day journey back to Canada. We came back across the Atlantic in a boat called the Orange, which was reputed to be an old banana boat. However, we had cabins, and we came in convoy, and the good thing about that was that, of course, we were shepherded by the American Air Force halfway across, and then by Coastal Command back to the UK. When we got back to the UK, we had a quick leave. I was terribly popular at home because my kit bag was stuffed full of cosmetics, chocolates, sweets, lots of nylons. They went off pretty well. So did I, I think. But our leave was short. We were posted back to our holding station and then to advanced flying unit at Watton in Norfolk, which was good for me because it was only 10 miles from home. And there we had the Miles Master Mark 1. This was the British answer to the Harvard, and frankly, it was a pretty utilitarian aircraft. It was remarkably good. It had a Kestrel engine, and it was the precursor, of course, for flying on Hurricane Spitfires and any single-engine aircraft in operation. I didn't take terribly kindly to it because after I'd gone about 5 hours solo, I had trouble with my undercarriage. I obviously lost hydraulic fuel and all sorts of things. The tower told me to do the standard procedure, you know, tight turns, dive, pull up, shake, rattle and roll, and but to no avail, and I eventually was sent to the auxiliary airfield some 10 miles south, and there did my first belly landing. This is one of the things that Bob Russell keeps talking about, damaged aircraft. I didn't do much damage to it at all. It bent the propeller a bit, but that's all. The second thing I remember about it was that we were doing formation flying, and I had a lot of engine trouble. Every time you advanced the throttle to take station with the instructor, the engine cut out and eventually I had to go back to the station. Landed with a lot of noise and a lot of bangs, but no real problem. And I was a bit hacked off because in my evaluation at the end of the month he said, formation flying weak. I maintained it was the engine that was weak. We were then looking forward to going to operational training. That was the thing, and that was just one stage nearer. What happened? I was sent to Harrogate on a general reconnaissance course. Now, I don't know if Bill Patterson's here today.
Yes, he is.
He is, good. Well, Bill knows what Harrogate's like because he's been there. And for those of you who don't know, it's a town in Yorkshire that is a spa town. You could take the water or you could not take it. In my case, the beer was a damn sight better than the water, believe me. It's revolting stuff. I don't know why anybody would pay to take it. And we were supposed to have this general reconnaissance course, and rumour had it, of course, that we were going to be posted to Wellingtons, Hamdens, all sorts of terrible aircraft, and there were half a dozen of us who frankly didn't want to go. We were not interested in it. And we did everything. In fact, we messed about. At signals, we had Aldous lamps from the top of the Majesty Hotel down into the grounds, and we wrote all sorts of things that had no comparison with anything that was transmitted. One of our favourites was to say, "See you tonight at the Hydro," a hotel in town that had ladies of ill repute, and nothing to do with what had been transmitted. And the other thing to do was that when we were doing navigation, we were doing sextant sights on the moon and stars, and we proved categorically that we were actually 10 miles north of Peking. So we were actually 20 miles south of York, of course, when we took the site. But we were finished up in front of the CO because really it was pretty childish. And he had, I think he was a very clever psychiatrist, really, a psychologist or whatever. And he said, "I understand that you're having trouble. I have two choices. One, I can post you to a station where you'll never fly an aircraft again, or you can pass the course at greater than an average of 80%, and I will personally guarantee that you're sent to a single engine operational training unit." Now, we were naive. We said, "Oh, that's fantastic, we'll do it." We knuckled down. We did actually pass greater than that, and to our amazement, we were posted to Fraserburgh in the north of Scotland, the number 8 operational training unit. Here we were at the station, and the first thing you do is go down to the flight line. What were we flying? 2 Master 2s, they were better than the 1s, and 6 Spitfires. We were elated, we were all that. And in the mess that night, we were saying, "Well, it's all right, but they haven't seen any guns." And so, never mind, that'll be explained to us. Next morning, the CEO came in, we all stood to attention. They'd already known of us on the course. And who should it be but Wing Commander Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton that Hess had tried to see previous year. Mild-mannered, but very, very commanding personality, somebody that you automatically respected. And he welcomed us all by name and said that he understood that we had been selected to come to this OGU, and it was his job to introduce us to the art of photographic intelligence, which would most probably make us realise why there were no guns in the aircraft. He pointed out to us that without photographic evidence, the strategy of Bomber Command and of Fighter Command could not be formed or evaluated unless they had the evidence. And as he had looked at our records, and we obviously could fly and could navigate, these would be honed and we would be introduced to the cameras that we would use. Had about 4 or 5 hours on the Masters. I flew for an hour and a half with the Duke, because he was fondly down on the station, and I was taken over to K9857, number Spitfire Mark 1, and it is on the screen. The interesting thing about the Mark 1 is, of course, it had a single a wooden propeller, and it had a pump-handled undercarriage, so that you advanced the throttle to take off, and as you got flying speed and you lifted it off, you changed hands and pumped away. Now obviously as you pumped forward, your left hand went back and so on and so forth, so that your actual takeoff not as smooth as I would really have liked. But nevertheless, it was a Spitfire, and I think that was absolutely elating as far as I was concerned. You're strapped in, with your Irving jacket, you're brushing the side of the cockpit, and those of you who have flown a Spitfire know that it is absolutely fantastic from the point of view that the controls are absolutely instantaneous and smooth. and you become at one with the aircraft very quickly. Without any more ado, and not going into a whole lot of details, but we were trained in flying at 36,000 feet because we had two cameras that were fitted underneath. They had a 60% overlap so that when the film was viewed, it was stereoscopically available to give you it in 3D. And in the port side, we had another camera fitted for obliques to take at ground level, 25 to 30 feet. And so, without too much more of a hassle, I was posted to #1 unit of photographic reconnaissance. They were down in Benson in Oxfordshire, and I was sent back to Scotland to the flight, because in those days they hadn't formed squadrons, they were just the one unit and lots of flights all around the place. And I went to 1406 up in the north of Scotland, and my when I arrived, my CO was Flight Lieutenant Suckling, and he was renowned. I don't know if we've got him here yet, have we? Oh, that's a Mark IV that we went onto the squadron, and they were the precursor for the 5, which became absolutely a terrific aircraft. Suckling was a flying officer who had that's me with the Mark IX. You'll see that the actual mounting for the cannon on that particular aircraft, when it came to be photographic reconnaissance, had a wooden cork with it, really, just to make sure that you didn't use it. In fact, the wing area, of course, had got fuel in. But as far as the Suckling was concerned, he was known as Babe, and he was responsible for finding the Bismarck. And as you know, the Bismarck was out, the hood came and they engaged it. Here he is, he found the Bismarck down there, and it came out, the hood came out from Scapa Flow, and the Bismarck, on its second salvage, hit the magazine of the hood, exploded, and within something like 3 to 5 minutes, it had gone down with a complement of a 1500. And of that 1500, there were just 3 survivors. By that time, he was a flight lieutenant. He was transferred south. We got another flight commander, and just after I'd been there, I hadn't been there for more than a month or so, and we had a flap. Those of you who go back to squadron days remember that you had days of just very, very little happening, and then suddenly there was a flap on, and the flap came that they'd just heard that there were 2 more battle cruisers that had left Brest. They thought it was the Chandos and Eisenhower, and anybody that was available, any aircraft that were available, out to look for them. I was one of the ones that we were sent to a given area. We did a square search, and those of you who are familiar with it know what a square search is. It is literally 30 seconds, a minute, 30 seconds you go back where you started from, theoretically. But nevertheless, if you do that in various ways, you cover an awful lot of ground. And this meant to say that we did it on our computer, our Dolphin computer that was strapped to your knee. We had facility, we had VHF by this time, and so when I sighted what I thought of the aircraft, with the ships, I told base, they said get photos, went down and tried to get some, what's the name, obliques down at fairly low level, and all hell broke loose. And those of you who know you've been shot at, you don't hear it, you see some traces. But I got what I thought was some reasonable photographs. Came back, and as I climbed away, the engine wasn't really running as well as it should do. So I headed for the coast, and without any more ado, suddenly realised that I was losing oil pressure. The oil was coming out, and gradually it became smoke, and smoke became fire. And when you're faced with a fire, they don't have a big decision. And you're trained to do something, and it's quite simple. You disconnect your radio, your oxygen mask, you jettison a hood, and undoing your straps, roll it on its back, kick the stick, and you catapult it out like a pea out of a pod. I landed in the hills just south of Dalwhinnie, which is in Scotland, just south of Inverness. And as I was picking up my chute in the heather, I looked round and I looked down the barrel of a 12-gauge shotgun. The farmer was there with two bloody great dogs, and I said to him something along the lines, the awful day, and he said, "Ach man, you're English." I don't know whether that was good or bad. I'm surprised he didn't actually pull the trigger. But he was a member of the Observer Corps. He took me back to the farmhouse. His wife brought me a cup of tea. He filled it up with some of his moonshine, which meant that I couldn't care less. Oh yeah, I'll tell you about that in just a second. Just afterwards, we found the turbines, which was in the field. These are actually nets to stop the torpedoes going in. But just to finish off the story, I went back to the little police station. They wrote out a warrant for me. The train was 4 hours later. I got in the train, and this wasn't long before. Nowadays you hear pilots are picked up by helicopters, taken back, and they're up in the air. I had to take my parachute, get in the train, put it up on the track, and get back to Inverness. By that time, everybody had closed, and I said to him, "Well, how do I get to the aerodrome?" He said, "It's down that way." And so I'm walking along with this bloody great parachute, and the police came up and they said, "Who are you?" Because we had a report of a German spy out there. They took me along to the guard room. I slept in the guard room, and the next day they came down and picked me up and took me back to the squadron. But the only good thing about that was that at the end of the week, the flight commander said, "Well, you know, you've had a bit of a rough ride, you better take a 48-hour leave." I said, "Well, that's awfully nice of you, sir, but, you know, where can I go? It'll take me 48 hours to get anywhere. Let's get anywhere back." And he said, "Yeah, but with an aircraft." And so I took an aircraft, I flew down to Norfolk, saw my fiancée. I didn't actually endear myself to her father because I went over his greenhouse, a very low private But it was nice because it made us happy. We came back, and one of the things that happened just after that was that we'd been going over to the fields in Norway, and we found the turbines. Historically, people will probably know that the Navy went in, 753 Squadron, I think it was, on Barracudas. They went in and they dropped torpedoes, and they were stopped in the net. And Bomber Command went in and disabled the turrets about a week later. Suddenly remembering that, talking about swordfish, you remember that the Bismarck, when it escaped and went round, was disabled by torpedoes from swordfish at the Fleet Air Arm before the Navy went in and sunk the Bismarck. Churchill's a complete, and oh, he was horrible about it. Anyway, we went on for quite some time, and I just mentioned in passing that on the squadron we had a fairly high attrition rate, really, and I think that all you can really say, if we're here today, many of us must say how lucky we were to get away with the number of trips that I did, which was something like, 150 or something like that. Admittedly, they were only 2, 5 and 6 hours, something like that, maybe at the maximum. But in the latter part of the time that I was there, I'd arranged to be married. We had Canadians, the New Zealanders, Australians at our wedding, and unfortunately my best man that should have been was a New Zealander. He was shot down a week before the wedding. And just to show how lucky you are, I came back and asked the flight commander if I could go as an extra lookout when they went out to see if they could find him. He said, no, you're on standby for tomorrow, you can't go. He didn't come back. So, you know, it just proves how lucky we were. When we finished, and I won't go into, one other thing on the squadron was that we got the Mark 9s that you saw just previously. I was there. They were lovely aircraft. They were the first ones to have partial pressurization, because when you go off at 36 to 42,000 with no pressurization, your body extends. And if you follow that logically through, you can know that you've got to get rid of the gases somewhere. And so it was rather discomforting, to say the least. And when you got pressurized back to perhaps 10 to 15,000, it was a lot more comfortable. Brian was telling me the other day that some of the early 9s, which I hadn't been aware of, did have trouble with some of the aileron and rudder controls, because the pressurization gave you a different factor as opposed to the exposed controls at the back. But we didn't have any trouble. Previously, we did have an awful lot of trouble with frosting inside the cockpit. The good thing about the training was that at PRU they taught you to swivel head and look, and if you did that, then you had time enough to get away. We were taught to side slip away, to twist and turn. You knew damn well that a Spit could turn inside a Messerschmitt at 109, but not to dive, because they had fuel injection and all those sort of things. On the PR unit, I thought you might be interested because I was able to acquire some of these pictures. Now, this one is taken immediately after the bombing of the Mona Dam. And here we have the water flying away with the terrible destruction that went on. The other thing too was, you can go on one, I think you've got down there. This is perhaps the classic. From Benson, we sent out an aircraft. It took 6 hours and 15 minutes for the bloke to get right across to the Baltic, up to the Peenemünde. And he took pictures of the actual pads. I don't know if you can see, not the palm graders, but the pads from which von Braun was launching or experimenting with the rockets that became the V2s. And so they sent Bomber Command over, and that's an example of what the bombing had done, and that actually meant that they had to move the factors further into Poland to get away from where the bombing was. Very briefly, after I came off the squadron, I was sent to a maintenance unit that was unpacking Mustangs. Yes, well that's me standing on the Mustang that was just up here in the car. A lovely aircraft. They were looking for people. They put it together, made it ready for the various squadrons, and unfortunately these ones still had the Allison engine, and so it was underpowered. When it got the Merlin, different aircraft, and became one of the great aircraft of the Second World War. Other thing that I was able to do was to take the Mark 9s and Mark 11 and take them to the various squadrons, and I had the thrill of actually taking one, or being told to take one, out to Burma. And I thought, fantastic, you go down to Portrait, go across to Gibraltar, along the north coast of Africa, get to Cairo. I'd always wanted to go to the pyramids. My father had been there after he'd been on Gallipoli, and my wife, who by this time was pregnant, said that, oh, you're going away, get some bananas. I've got a craving for bananas. I got to Portrait, and the duty officer said, I'm sorry, I can't release you. You're posted to the Fleet Air Arm. And I said, look, forget it. He said, it's an Air Ministry posting if I let you go. And so I was sent to the Fleet Air Arm. And there, for my sins, I flew a swordfish. Now this is lovely. I mean, after all, I've been used to screaming around about 350 miles an hour, and I got into this thing. And a great big Pratt & Whitney engine, which they swore didn't stop, but on the other hand, it didn't go very fast. I don't know exactly. I think they were specified to do about 85 to 90. And in fact, on one occasion, I remember that was going over our Broth, and with a headwind, the cars were going faster than we were. they also had the albacore, which is not dissimilar, if you may recall. It had an enclosed cockpit, and that was about the same. It reminded me very much of sitting on the front of a double-decker bus in London. You got bam, ba, 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 and eventually you sort of glided on, staggered off. But the only other thing, though, the idea was that they wanted pilots to build up for what was going to be a diversion for D-Day. And those of you who know the history, you know that in Scotland there were 2 or 3 divisions that were phantom divisions. They had all of the signals going about, and the German intelligence firmly believed that there were divisions training there, and all the usual things like cardboard cutouts and blow-up tanks, etc. And we were then turned over to train on these things and to have a diversion. The only good thing about it was that before we could do that, well, it wasn't really a good thing, we were sent barracudas. Now, those of you who know what a barracuda is, oh no, they just mentioned D-Day. There's a couple of pictures that were taken by a squadron leader down at PRU, and these are what they called hedgehogs, and they were to impede the actual landing craft, and some of these had charges put in so that not only did you roll foul of them, you blew up. And if you've got any eyesight, I haven't, but somewhere along there you may even be able to pick them out. Now the good thing about all this, we did it right down from the north of Norway, right the way down to the north of Spain. And the idea was that all the people who went ashore with ordnance survey maps had pictures all along the front of what you would see. So that, for instance, when you went from once you got onto the beach, this is what you would literally see, not just a... Now, coming back to what I was involved in, which was horrible, these are... They are the barracuda. Yep. Ferry Barracuda. Designed as a dive bomber, Mark 1 had a lot of trouble with it, because when you put it into the dive, you got tail flutter, and eventually the tail came off. They modified it, and they brought the tail, that's why the tail went up nearly a metre, which is to save this tail flutter. But the thing that was rather disconcerting was that immediately you put your dive brakes on and went down, the rivets on the wing started popping off. And you filled out the 700 and said, oh, 3 rivets missing on the port wing. Oh, yeah, we'll put some more back on. And, and then, of course, we lost an awful lot of aircraft. In fact, it was pretty disturbing that when they did an air test, I remember on one occasion, and 2 of the Wrens went up, and they went in when the wing came off. So I got more twitch in that than anything else. But anyway, that was, the whole thing was, we had a massive aircraft attacking the northern part of Europe and into Norway, so that they had to keep divisions up there, and it was a side issue from the D-Day of the 6th of June 1944. After that, I spent the rest of my time as an instructor at Cranwell College, and frankly enjoyed that immensely, and the war for me was over. I carried on flying afterwards privately, and on the strength of my friends in Australia and New Zealand who said that God's own country, I thought, right, I could crop dusting. But they sent me all the details of crop dusting, and in the back it gave you the fatalities. I didn't know crop dusting. Thanks for listening. Hope I haven't bored you.